on a mission.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you to my colleague for the time. I'm going to try and give as much context as I can at the beginning, and then ask the questions at the end. And I apologize for the length, but just trying to get through it all. I've been working with various organizations within my riding, all dealing with watershed issues. It actually spans quite a wide area, but all underneath one watershed. So by way of context, the Joe Rich community, and they have a very well-organized group, big kudos to them, has noted a major shift in the water paths due to both forestry and forestry practices in the area, as well as recent fires. So flooding from Mission Creek has been frequent in the last years, both in the creek as well as on the highway. Culverts have been washed out during spring freshet, and there are areas of the highway that are flooding actually from above, where fires have devastated the hillside. I want to shout out kudos to both Gorman Brothers and the Ministry of Forests staff who worked with the Joe Rich community to preserve one of the last areas of natural forest before the creek, just to help with the water flow that was coming from above, and quite a large area from above. But the issue of the watershed continues. The Mission Creek area further down on KLO has equally experienced repeated flooding and are bracing for flooding again this year. The headlines all this week have been about the flooding that's been announced that will probably happen. As a former resident of this particular area for almost 15 years, and then as a resident of Kelowna for over 25, I can tell you that places that are flooding now in that creek bed were areas that I used to be able to walk under the bridges. I couldn't even crawl under those very same bridges with, barely 2 feet of clearance that are going underneath them. So obviously, as the capacity of the creek is minimized with the sediment that's coming down from farther upstream, obviously now it's just turning into one large floodplain. I've got farmers who are losing arable land that they've had in their families for generations, and literally almost 100 years. And I also have other area residents who are trying desperately to do whatever they are able to prevent the flooding, but it's causing considerable damage. So, but that's not all. There's more. In recent meetings with the Okanagan Basin Water Board and conversations with the residents that live along not just Mission Creek or Mill Creek, which also floods, but also along Okanagan Lake, conversations about the actual flow of water in and out of Lake Okanagan have come to the forefront. As some of my riding borders on Lake Okanagan Lake, it's apparent that the flooding incidents of the last few years are due to the water flow and how much is being predicted and what's not being adequately predicted. We had about a month ago complaints that the water was so low that many of the properties along there were losing some of their amenities, but not just amenities. It's also this fear of, where is it going to go to? And now they're predicting flooding just 1 month later, because we're going from 6 degrees to 27 this weekend. So yes, sorry for the long preamble, but hopefully it will help to give my question some context. I'm looking for a mechanism to have the entirety of the watershed studied. I have willing participants, but no one's really clear on who will guide that process. Obviously, because the watershed is quite large, we're talking about multiple regional districts, many municipalities. We've got First Nations, we've got community groups. So it's quite complicated, and I do have organizations that are willing to bring all of those to the table. But my question is, number one, how do we actually get funding for the study? Number two, how do we get funding for the repairs that will need to be taken place? Last year, when the flooding occurred, I was trying to work alongside both the regional district and the city, and both of them kind of threw their hands up and said, "It's not us. We don't have any money for that type of an endeavor." Obviously, yes, we can say climate change, we can say emergency readiness, we can say, the fires have caused it, or can we? And so it's a very complicated situation, but one that's growing in urgency every single year. And obviously the flooding continues. So with that, I'll leave my question to the minister and hope for an answer.
Minister.
Thank you very much, Chair. And I thank my colleague for bringing the example forward. It was recently said climate change mitigation is all about carbon. Climate change adaptation is all about water. We were canvassing this earlier, where we've had stage 4 and 5 level droughts at the same time in the same region, just one valley over where there was a major flood crisis. Yeah, as somebody said, welcome to climate change, and this is why the estimates of what the impacts in terms of cost would be stratospheric. Because just in the region my friend referred to, I don't know, but I could imagine that the cost for repair of damaged infrastructure runs far beyond the capacities of any regional district to be able to do it. And that's just 1 year, and it's unlikely to change. So a couple of things. I see the Minister of Forests is with us today, and Forests has launched a very good flood mapping and strategy program. So that might be something to contemplate in terms of resourcing, because the estimates that we used to put to what a 100-year flood experience would be in my part of the world, in the Northwest, we'd be very frustrated because you could see that they were no longer true. And yet, if the province doesn't issue new maps, then people were buying properties into what are now 20-year flood plains. They're not 100, because they would be happening over and over again. Our friends at EMCR have the responsibility, and it's often done, as we saw with the atmospheric river and the impacts that it had, particularly in the Lower Mainland. That's a joint provincial federal repair initiative. The effects that were so devastating on our infrastructure, that's why that ministry has been stood up. Emergency management and climate readiness. I would suggest, and the minister would have much better insights and more thoughtful about it, but you don't create a ministry for nothing, and the creation of that ministry was because of the exact examples that are happening all across the province. Last thing I would point to is a potential opportunity. So there's an invitation to come talk to us about if the area, the region is looking for some watershed planning level conversation. It sounds like the scale is large, the players are large, so let's scope it. Let's find out what it is. Recently, our ministry announced a $100 million watershed securities fund, which is, we talked a little bit about earlier. Is meant to grow. It starts at 100 million, but we've already heard from the federal government, from philanthropic groups and others, that this is now a good container in which to put money because it's got that enduring quality, which is the second point. It's meant to last in perpetuity. It's not a fund to spend out in a year. And the Real Estate Foundation of BC is our partners in that, who have been excellent. And last thing I'll say is that we ran the Healthy Watershed Initiative, about $57 million over a couple of years. That was about restoring the resiliency of watersheds. And we have some amazing examples up island here where a watershed had received funding and support and had rehabilitated its resiliency. There was an atmospheric river. The valley over, the watershed over, did not. And the experience, particularly on things like salmon recovery and the ability of the watershed to absorb that flood event, that rain event, was just night and day contrasts. So we have living examples, even just the last few years, of what does that investment do for communities like my friend represents when work has been done to restore and recover the resiliency of those watersheds. The impacts of whether it's farming, mining, forestry, have had impacts on the absorption rate of these watersheds. And we see the downstream effects, so to speak. So that's why the restoration economy, we haven't talked a lot about that here today, but this is a growing part of the so-called blue or green economy, depending on what you want to frame it as. I think it's only going to grow for our ability. So we welcome see this as an invitation. Come talk to us about this. Let's scale and scope it out. Know this, though, that the list of communities coming forward desiring watershed plans is significant. As soon as we announced it, the calls started coming in because local governments, First Nations, residents are seeing the change and are rightly concerned with their ability to have a good plan going forward. So thank you, Chair.
Member.
Thank you so much, Chair, and thank you, Minister, for that answer. The Okanagan is as a whole very large, and our watershed is very large. the area. And it would be difficult, I think, for any one organization to come forward and say, well, we want this planning to be completed. So in further clarification, and I am going to absolutely take the minister up on the offer to continue this, but in terms of the lead on this type of an initiative, and I recognize as well that the watershed planning is different than the repair work that needs to be completed. My concern is, how do you actually draw the direct link between either, Ministry of Forests and the watershed issues that we're having today in Mission Creek, or the fires and the issues that we're having in Mission Creek and on the highway, et cetera, or in the floodplain or in the KLO area? How do we draw that direct correlation and gain access to emergency funding? Or is this maintenance funding that we need to accelerate because of climate change? So there were two questions in there. One was on the how, which organization leads it, and then the second is, how do we actually access emergency funding if it's actually funding that needs to be done on an ongoing basis to mitigate climate change?
Minister.
Thank you. We were talking a little bit earlier about what's the nature of this ministry, its design, and its design principles that we got when we created the ministry. And one of them is to help convene government when necessary, when there are multiple government interests at play. My friend outlined it very well: EMCR, forests, ourselves at Walrus, probably municipal affairs, and some others will be implicated by this. That I think would be the scoping conversation that we would have. We would be the ones committing to the convening part. First Nations partnerships are going to be critical in this, as they are right across the. I don't know if we mentioned or canvassed that particular piece in the region. The general framework and the modernization of the Emergency Management Act that this government has gone through is to agree to a couple of really important principles. One being the Sunday principle, just in terms of what comes back, but also the build back principle, build back better. We saw this in the Fraser Valley when we sought partnerships with the federal government initially. Federal funding was restricted to only build back to the standard of what was there before. So in the midst of an emergency and trying to bring crews in and make sure that whatever infrastructure we were going to leave in place would be able to handle the next major water event, we ran into a policy barrier with our Ottawa partners who said, well, you can only build a culvert to the same size that it was. The one that blew out and wiped out Highway 1, you've got to build it to the exact same size. Well, that's an outdated policy. The feds have moved on that, gratefully. It's an unfortunate experience. So I think when you start to line up those principles and dealing with something where it doesn't just feel like things have fundamentally shifted, things have fundamentally shifted. The infrastructure, the policies that we had in place 30 years ago didn't anticipate this properly, and some still don't. But in terms of the Okanagan experience and people just not being aware of what it's going to look like, not just in 2023, but 2033 and 43. This is why the watershed planning has to incorporate that as well. And I'll end on that, Chair, is that when we bring those groups together, when we can help convene the provincial ministries that have an interest in a watershed security plan, one doesn't do it for today anymore. One has to do it anticipating these highly varied climate events, that the rain doesn't fall the same way or at the same time, at the same intensity that it used to. And we've seen this. And so the impacts of everything have to be contemplated as best as we can. So again, the invitation is there. Happy in terms of what the community sends to us as leads. I think that was part of the question. I don't know if that my friend was asking for the leads from the province side or from the community side. We don't dictate. We don't say for a watershed security plan to come forward it has to be, but the usual so-called usual suspects, even in over a large area, will hopefully create a much more durable and thoughtful plan, rather than a small nonprofit trying to do their best, but not including local government, not including First Nations, wouldn't be as encouraging for us. So thank you for the question.
Member.
Thank you so much, Chair, and thank you, Minister, for the answer. And I welcome the invitation. I will take you up on it aggressively, and I will definitely be moving on this because time is clearly not on our side. And just as my final thought, the Okanagan is home. Just the Kelowna CMA is home to almost 250,000 people. So it is a very beautiful area with all of our resources, our natural resources like water and our agriculture, and we're looking forward to protecting that as best we can. So I welcome that, and yes, we'll definitely get those people at the table. Thank you.